So, hi everyone, welcome back. I'm Will. I'm the Schools Liaison Officer at Corpus, and the aim of this talk is essentially just to go through some ways that you can really enhance a competitive application to us over the course of the summer. Michael's spoken already a little bit about the importance of what we call supercurricular engagement for choosing a course, and I essentially just want to go into a little bit more depth about supercurricular engagement in general, and some of the other reasons that it's important and essentially how to do it well. So just as a brief outline, I'm going to start just by talking about why we think supercurricular engagement is important. I'll define that in a second. I'm then going to talk about how you can, what I've called, obtain critical depth within supercurricular engagement. So I'll essentially signpost you towards some resources or some examples of resources that are really useful for getting to grips with the right methodology for the subject that you're interested in. I'll then go on to sort of talk about a few ideas for broader thinking around your subject. So sort of things that are perhaps less focused on critical depth and more just to do with understanding general connections within your subject and from your subject to other subjects. And finally, if there's time, I wanted to talk a little bit about more difficult resources, the sorts of stuff that you might start engaging with once you've got a handle on all of the above. And obviously, if there are questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A throughout, and then I'll get to them at the end. So firstly, just to define my terms, I suppose, by supercurricular engagement, and you might be familiar with this term already, I mean academic engagement that goes essentially beyond what the A-level curriculum is currently offering you, often in terms of the sort of sophistication of the content that you're looking at, and sometimes also in terms of the content as well. Sometimes it's sort of content that isn't on your A-level syllabus too. But an example in arts and humanities would be, for instance, reading some kind of I don't know, critical review of even a book that you've looked at on the A-level syllabus, or it might be reading about a theory that simply isn't covered at all. An example in STEM, in sciences, for instance, might be simply going further into the technicalities of a topic that has been covered, for instance, in biology A-level. And this kind of engagement, the kind of engagement that takes you beyond the A-level curriculum in one way or another, contrasts really starkly with extracurricular engagement. And that's the kind of stuff that you might include a few lines on in a personal statement, for instance, but it's stuff like having hobbies, having sort of spare time in general, volunteering in a non-sort of academic capacity, for instance. It's stuff that doesn't really inform us about your passion or competence in a subject, and concerns is more concerned with sort of the well-roundedness of you as an individual. And we are specifically interested when we're looking at your application in the supercurricular stuff. So the stuff that you've done to further your interest in your subject. And that's true of a lot of other competitive universities as well. And if you take one sort of general thing away from this talk, it's that supercurricular engagement is really the key to doing a competitive application. It's the main thing you can be doing over summer to really increase your chances of, for instance, receiving an offer from us. So I'm now just going to go on to talk a little bit about why supercurricular engagement is important. And I've listed I've sort of got 5 main points here. The first is essentially that when we look at your personal statement, for instance, and if it's sort of covered in lots of supercurricular activities, you're telling us that you've done lots of things beyond the A-level curriculum. That gives us, depending on what you've done, that gives us a sense of your capacity to learn independently without sort of generally just learning from in a sort of classroom context. It tells us whether or not you can go off on your own and actually learn about a subject, and that's pretty important, especially at places like Cambridge and Oxford, for sort of just getting on within the supervision system, which I can sort of perhaps talk about if people have questions at the end. It also shows us that you are enthusiastic about the actual contents and also perhaps more importantly, methodology of the course you've applied to. So if we read on your personal statement that you have engaged in, you're applying for natural sciences, for instance, maybe the physical sciences. Suppose you've done a lot of mathematics, trying to solve a lot of mathematics problems or physics problems beyond A level. That tells us that you've sort of looked into the course, you've understood what you're going to be doing as an undergraduate, day to day, the kinds of problems you're going to be solving, and you're actually interested in those. And that contrasts with what lots of applicants will sometimes do, is that they will read perhaps works of popular fiction or popular non-fiction, sorry, about a subject. So they might read Hawking's Brief History of Time or something, and not maybe engage in actual physics problems. And that happens fairly regularly. And obviously, as a physics undergraduate, for instance, you're not going to be reading works directed at the general public on a day-to-day basis. So engaging with the right kinds of supercurricular activities shows us that you've actually given the course its content and methodology sufficient thought in advance. And that links to this idea of selecting an enjoyable course that Michael was talking about. The more time you spend actually figuring out what you enjoy about a subject, and you do that by engaging with the subject beyond A level, the higher the chances are that you will have picked the right course and you'll enjoy your undergraduate. And then, so I mean, these first 2 points really sort of relate quite strongly to the personal statement. So they relate to, what were our sort of first impressions of you when we read the personal statement. But engaging with supercurricular content is important, has importance beyond that. So one thing, for instance, it might not be sort of in the forefront of your mind at the moment, but is this idea of aiding the transition to higher education. The more time you spend looking at stuff that's really challenging, that's challenging beyond A level, the easier that leap from A level to undergraduate will be. And if you're applying to an undergraduate degree, you presumably want to do well in it. So it's it might seem far off now, but it is a very useful thing to have done. And then there are certain things in A level. There are certain features of A levels themselves that sort of lend themselves to supercurricular engagement. So 2 examples here are, firstly, in lots of subjects, so biology is an example here, supercurricular engagement will almost be built into the mark scheme in many respects. So at the end of a biology exam, for instance, you might get a long essay that you have to write, sort of essay for sort of higher marks. Often in those, there is an expectation that the students scoring the most highly will actually have deployed content that goes beyond what's on the A-level syllabus. So in that sense, there's this very specific sense in which looking at stuff beyond the A-level curriculum, even if it's related to a subject that you're studying, is important for A-levels themselves. And then more generally, if, for instance, you are solving maths problems at a higher level than A-level, the thought is that your ability to, perhaps your creativity in approaching problems, or your ability not to be fazed by certain complexities in an exam, those things will hopefully improve, and you'll actually feel a lot more confident within your A-levels themselves. And the same for essay writing subjects as well. If you are thinking about more sophisticated ideas, you're writing more even just because you're engaging in this kind of stuff as well as your A-levels, the thought is that your exam responses will be more sophisticated, and you'll do better in that more sort of qualitative sense. And then there are other aspects of beyond the personal statement of the admissions process for Cambridge, for instance, where having done a lot of supercurricular engagement can come in quite handy. Admissions assessments are one thing, and also interviews. In the interviews, we often will present you with some kind of problem, puzzle, perhaps even a piece of text, and we will ask you to talk about that a bit with us. And if you've been, what I'm going to go on to talk about in a minute is how to engage with supercurricular activities in the correct kind of way. And if you've been doing that, hopefully it will become clear. Being presented with a piece of, a passage of text and being asked to talk about it in an interview will seem a lot less daunting if you've been doing this kind of stuff. So the point of showing you this and talking about the slide at such length is that there are reasons to do this kind of engagement beyond just the personal statement. And you'll notice that the personal statement hasn't actually appeared in the text on this slide. And I think there is a sort of common misconception that the reason that you read beyond your subject, for instance, is so you can list a few books in your personal statement. And that's sort of, the end game in a sense of doing that. But hopefully you can see that that's not really true. And the other reason for showing you this is that you can sort of use it as a sort of as a list, in a sense, or almost sort of a tick box list, where you can ask of any particular thing that you are engaging with beyond A level, you can ask if it ticks any of these boxes. So you can ask if the activity you're engaging with is going to help you actually choose an enjoyable course. You can ask if you can use any of the stuff that you're looking at to help with your A levels, either directly or indirectly. And you can ask if it's the right kind of format helping you practice for something like the interview. So hopefully all that makes sense. And if anything's unclear on this, I'm happy to answer questions at the end. So now I'm going to move on to talking about some specific resources that hopefully will give you, will hopefully help you obtain some critical depth in your subject in one sense or another. So the first thing I wanted to highlight is quite a straightforward one. It's course reading lists. And there are two of these to distinguish, actually. One, so at most subjects at pretty much any university will have what's called a reading list for prospective applicants in a subject. And essentially that's the reading list that has been created for people like you who are applying to university at the moment, who are thinking about making an application. And it's the kind of stuff that is meant to give you a sense of the subject in terms of what's covered on the subject, in terms of how academics in the field will approach the subject. And that can be a very, very useful resource. And you can find those online, often just by typing in, course reading list as an prospective applicant or something like that. But the other reading list that you can start to play about with at this stage is the actual undergraduate reading lists themselves. They vary in terms of their accessibility between universities and also between subjects. But often you'll be able to find at least a sort of rudimentary reading list that's actually more geared towards undergraduates. And the reason for looking at that is not that I'm suggesting that you go off and you try and learn the undergraduate syllabus, for instance, and read all the papers and stuff on those, but rather you can look at that and you can take specific topics that are going to come up on the undergraduate now, because you're reading the undergraduate reading list, and you can use the name of that topic that perhaps catches your interest as a starting point for further engagement. So by all means, you can find something on a reading list for undergraduates and think, actually, I can have a go at reading this and I think I might understand it. But the main thing is that you can take the topics and you can use those as a basis for, a mini research project, for instance. So the example, which I won't go onto the site, I won't use the hyperlink actually, but the example I've got hyperlinked is the philosophy reading list for undergraduates. I think for the part one, so first year metaphysics. And on that, you might find, for instance, miracles, you might find topics like free will, and you might think, well, those look interesting. You might have encountered those in religious studies or philosophy A level, but then, you might find things to do with consciousness, for instance, and things like dualism and physicalism, and you might think that those would make interesting projects to focus in on and learn more about. And that's quite a good way of making sure that what you're talking about in your personal statement, and also what you're just engaging with in general, is related to the course you actually want to apply for. And if you do find interesting books on the reading list, or you find interesting topics that you'd like to have a look at, one good resource to use is the Open Library. This is probably more directed towards arts and humanities students, but there is stuff for STEM on here as well, specifically textbooks that you might find specific chapters interesting. An Open Library is a free resource. It's sort of just a big internet archive. And as you can see, there are sort of like novels and just sort of standard books to look at on here. But there are also a lot of very sort of high caliber academic books that you can find on here. They don't have everything, but they often do have sort of scanned copies of things which you wouldn't really find anywhere else online, and you might not even find online with university access, access to university e-resources. So this is a very good thing to use to help you find specific books or articles to engage with. It's very useful for project work as well. So those two resources that I've just highlighted are more for sort of honing in on particular topics or books of interest. I now want to talk a little bit about some resources which perhaps at first look a little sort of sparse, but actually are incredibly useful for getting the right methodology and the right kind of understanding of how you should be approaching your topic, or your subject, sorry. So the first of these is HE+. And Michael mentioned this earlier. This is, you might have heard of this. It's a really great site. It basically, it was created by Cambridge University, and it's basically covers all of the subjects that we offer at undergraduate. And what you get are, firstly, specific exercises that are designed by academics within those subjects. And those exercises are essentially a bit like extension work. They're very specific supercurricular activities. So for chemistry, for instance, you might be shown some kind of diagram of a molecule and be presented with some information about it, and then ask certain sort of, thought-provoking questions about that. And there are also sort of further links to websites which we also think are very useful for this kind of work. And HE Plus really sort of is very similar to another kind of resource, which is virtual classrooms. And the example here is the history virtual classroom from Cambridge as well. Virtual classrooms are very similar in that they provide specific exercises for you to have a look at. It's not just sort of signposting you towards topics or books. It's sort of actually laying out particular, in the case of history, it's laying out particular primary sources, extracts of primary sources, and asking you questions about those sources, asking you to sort of think about, why the source was written, what insights you can sort of you can get from a particular paragraph. But the really useful thing about any of these resources is that they encourage you to engage with the subject with the correct methodology. So they don't just say, oh, you should look into this topic, and then you sort of go off on your own and read as much as you can about it, even if it's sort of the wrong stuff in the wrong way. It shows you how to actually work within the topic, within the subject, sorry. So in the case of history, you have, like I said, these primary sources, these extracts of them, and then you're asked questions about those sources. And what that's sort of showing you is that in order to engage in history in a sort of competent way, you don't have to read tons and tons of primary sources in order to sort of look impressive in your personal statement, but rather your time is better spent engaging with in a more modular way with a primary text. Reading a paragraph as many times as you can, reading it against the grain, trying to actually understand what's going on and what insights can be gauged from particular parts of a primary source. And it really gives you the kind of idea of how much you can understand and gain from very small pieces of writing. And obviously that translates, right, to what I was saying before of how this kind of supercurricular engagement is useful for something like the interview. In the interview, you're given, for history, for instance, you might be given a piece of text, maybe a couple of paragraphs to analyze and talk about in the interview. And obviously this is sort of preparing you for that in possibly the most direct way, that it could. And there are examples of this in STEM as well. So obviously HE Plus sort of has lots of examples of these things, but there are specific examples in STEM as well as arts and humanities. So this is another resource that you might be familiar with called ISAC Physics. And ISAC Physics is essentially a bit like the virtual classroom for history, but for physics. And I'd say it's probably a little bit more comprehensive in terms of what you can cover. But the really nice thing about, there are lots of great resources within this, but one great thing is the question finder. And in the question finder, you can select a particular level that you want to be given questions, and you can select a particular topic as well. There's a lot of physics and mathematics, and there's also some chemistry to choose from as well. And what this does is it gives you challenging questions. If you select sort of the higher levels in the question finder, it gives you challenging questions that are sort of stretching you beyond the demands of sort of the A-level syllabus, and making sure that you're engaging with physics in the right way. So I mentioned before that looking at popular works of non-fiction about physics doesn't really cut it, because that's not what you're going to be doing as an undergraduate. Whereas challenging yourself, looking at more and more complex physics problems, that is what you're going to be doing. And so it makes sense to actually practice that as your supercurricular engagement. And so hopefully this is sort of good news for people interested in mathematically technical subjects like physics, because the essential point is that rather than having to read things which don't really seem to relate to the day-to-day activities, of an A-level physicist, you actually just get to do more physics, which, yeah, hopefully is good news, if anything. This side is also useful for things like economics. As you might be aware, anyone wanting to study economics might be aware, there is a sizable mathematical component to economics, and we may even ask you economics questions in interview. And a site like this, focusing on the mathematics, for instance, will help you a lot in that respect. So I've talked a little bit about websites that can hopefully help you gain some kind of understanding of what it takes to engage critically in a subject. So in the case of HE+, that basically covers all the subjects. And then I gave you two examples of history and physics. And the idea is that using those resources, even if they seem a little sparse, and you think that you should actually be reading whole books, for instance, and that's the way to impress admissions tutors, for instance, actually those resources are giving you the correct methods for engaging critically with particular subjects. So actually, just to hold off going on to this for a second, what you might do, for instance, is you might use, let's use the philosophy example. So you might use HE+ and engage with some stuff in philosophy, sort of understand and appreciate how to do that in quite a modular sense. And then you might go to the course reading list, find a topic, find a particular interesting paper, either online or on the reading list, use the open library to find it, and then engage with that particular thing in the way that HE+, for instance, has shown you. So that might be a natural progression in the summer for, you might sort of start at the beginning, just gaining an appreciation of how to engage with your subject, and then you might move on to some particular things that aren't featured on websites like this, and that might, and those things are the things that you might be particularly interested in. Even if you're not interested in, for instance, the content of the primary sources on the History Virtual Classroom, you still would have gained a lot by working through those examples. So yeah, that's I'm happy to answer some more or some questions about that kind of critical engagement in a moment. I now just want to move on to going through a few resources that are useful for broader thinking. And this is just this is just me wanting to emphasize that while engaging critically in a subject is very, very important, that shouldn't mean that you that you push out the kind of more lateral thinking, the kind of just thinking broadly and less critically about your subject as well. That stuff is very useful. Podcasts are a particularly good way to do this. You might listen to a particular podcast, even on something like BBC's In Our Time, and that might give you some further ideas, for instance, for a more critical project or a more in-depth project. But in general, listening to this kind of stuff just casually is very useful as well. It helps you figure out where your subject or a particular topic sits in the academic landscape, and it just emphasizes a different approach to the subject that is also useful. Not to say that podcasts, however, are only to be used for this kind of broad or fuzzy thinking. You'll be able to find lots of podcasts, whatever your subject, that go into quite a lot of critical detail. So the example here is from Oxford's philosophy faculty. here are a lot of their podcasts, for instance, and you can see they have things like Philosophy for Beginners. They have interviews with philosophers, things that you can just watch casually and gain that kind of broader appreciation of the subject. But they also have series of lectures which actually are quite in depth and would probably be more on the kind of critical focus side of supercurricular engagement. So Nietzsche on Mind and Nature and Kant's Critique of Pure Reason are two such sort of lecture series. Other broad material, this is quite a good website to sort of have a look at casually. It's called The Conversation. It's basically a news outlet that's written entirely by academics. This is quite good for, I think you're often told as an A-level student that it's useful to read the news, keep up with current events and things, especially developments in the field you're interested in. And this would be a good site to find those kinds of recent developments. I think there's a spectrum of views and beliefs on this site that I think I can point you towards it. But typically the level of depth and the sort of level of thinking is a lot better than you would find in typical news outlets, because it is just written by academics who are experts in the fields that they're talking about. So it's a very useful thing just to look at casually. And again, like with reading, with listening to podcasts, you might find interesting ideas for more critical research projects by looking at this kind of stuff. Finally, on broad, sort of on broad thinking, there's social media as well. And you might sort of often think of social media as just, something to where to engage with friends and sort of maybe look at standard concepts of news. But there is a very real sense in which a platform like Twitter can be used for supercurricular engagement in a very beneficial way. So my suggestion on this would essentially just be to follow things like what I've listed here. So follow academics in your subject, follow academic societies, follow journals, so academic journals, university departments, things like that. And what that will do is it will ensure that your Twitter feed has a sort of constant flow of supercurricular engagement for you to choose from. Sort of lots of different articles, videos, interesting content, and then that kind of takes the burden off you to an extent in terms of actually finding some of the interesting material to look at. And the other useful thing about this is that often academics who have Twitter, not all of them, but a lot of them are very interested in public-facing academia. And that means that you'll find people that are explaining concepts that are at quite a high level and might be inaccessible, for instance, to an A-level student without this kind of presentation. You'll find people talking about these very difficult topics in a way that hopefully actually is quite accessible. So the example I've got here is another philosophy example, but it's a philosopher at Nottingham who does all these great YouTube videos on different topics in philosophy, and some of it is, well, a lot of it is aimed at undergraduates, but it is sort of accessible to A-level students with who haven't perhaps done these kinds of courses in philosophy that the topics often assume. So the example here is the Barkin sentence, which is quite a difficult topic in modal logic in philosophy that you sort of cover in second year. And this person explains very clearly why this topic is of interest, how you might go about learning more about it. It's very clear. And I think the point to emphasize is that I think if an A-level student interested in philosophy had come to this topic in a different mode of presentation, so they'd looked at an academic paper that covers this topic, for instance, I think they'd find it off-putting, because philosophers working on these sorts of topics typically aren't very accommodating for people without the requisite background. But if you approach it this way, you'd probably be able to have a really good go at understanding maybe even some of the papers that would initially have been off-putting. So this is just to emphasize that the way in which you come to a subject, the way in which you actually first start thinking about it and arrive at it, is quite important. And Twitter can very much be your friend in that respect. Okay, so I'm running a little bit short on time, but I did just want to quickly emphasize a few more things. Firstly, there's just this, I'll leave this up for a second because obviously we're recording, so you can just look at the slides when we, or just screenshot them now. But there are a few more suggestions for finding resources that are open access, that are useful for supercurricular engagement. And I've listed some really obvious ones that sometimes I think people forget to do as well. So, you know, if you're looking for a particular topic, for instance, you found something on a course reading list and you want to know more about it, you can often just Google the key terms, or really silly things like, you know, best archives for this subject, or, you know, a particular text and then PDF after it. And you'll often actually be able to find a lot of free resources that way. So don't sort of be put off, just finding things through those kinds of mediums. Another useful thing to use is Wikipedia. You might want to take things that Wikipedia itself says with a pinch of salt, but one thing it's very useful for is finding references, finding articles in a particular topic. So you might go on a Wikipedia article and you might head straight to the references, and you can often find open access PDFs of interesting academic papers or articles on those, because there's no constraint on a writer of Wikipedia having, you know, they don't have to have university ebook access. So it sort of stands to reason that the stuff that they cite isn't always going to be restricted to, you know, people who have university access online. So that's quite a good, another good place to find resources. I've spoken a little bit about university resources like reading lists already, but it's worth mentioning that you can also find things like lecture slides, handouts, even archives that universities have online to find some of this content. There are archives that don't belong necessarily to particular universities as well. I've mentioned Open Library. There are a few other suggestions here as well. The other thing to note is that academic journals, even the ones that ask you to pay, often allow you to read at least some articles for free. And it's always worth having a look at those. Magazines, very much the same thing. Online magazines like New Scientist and things, for instance, they require subscription, but sometimes they let you look at a few articles for free. Sometimes your school will have access to them as well. That's not always guaranteed. And the thing that I haven't mentioned, actually, which perhaps I should have done, is online courses. These are often a really good way to boost understanding of particular topics, and they look really good on a personal statement. These two sites in particular are very good for finding interesting and actually quite challenging courses. Perhaps a brief note, just to say that some of these courses, I mean, they're all free, but sometimes they ask you, you know, do you want to pay £50 for a certificate or something? Please don't feel that you need to do that for, you know, reading the stuff for a Cambridge application, for instance, because we just care that you've done the actual engagement. If you say that you've done a particular online course, we believe you. We don't need a certificate for proof. Good. Yeah, so finally, there are just a few, I just wanted to sort of draw your attention to a few online archives and lists that can be useful for finding more difficult resources. These resources are not things that we would expect A-level students to have looked at, but they can be quite helpful in the sense that you can use them as, when you're looking into a particular topic, you can kind of use particular difficult academic papers as a kind of benchmark, as something to, even if you don't think you're going to understand it at the end of a particular, a particular research project or a particular thing you're engaging with, are very useful to sort of try to work up to. So a really good thing to draw your attention to, I think, is the Wiki Wand list of open access journals. This is literally just a random list of journal articles from the web, but it does it alphabetically. It does it subject by subject. So it has stuff for agriculture, it has stuff for chemistry, has stuff for philosophy and for law and things like that. And you can look at these sort of high caliber academic journals that will contain often quite seminal or interesting work within particular topics. So just to give you an idea of the kind of scope of this stuff, and these examples are taken from this list here, because there are so many interesting things that you might want to engage with on these kinds of sites, even if it leaves you with a lot of questions. So for instance, this is the Programming Historian. This is actually essentially a blog. It is aimed at giving technical skills to historians, essentially, as I sort of noted here. And an example piece of work that you might read is this here, and I'll just move my screen so I can see it, extracting illustrated pages from digital libraries of Python. I mean, this is just to emphasize the range of stuff that is on websites like this. This isn't something that you would have to engage with when making an application to history, but it's something that might help you out. In particular, what this article is doing is it's explaining how you would use sort of basic sort of, I don't even know whether to call it programming, but let's call it basic programming tools to extract all of the pages from a big manuscript online that have pictures on them, to extract all of those and put them into one document. So you might have you might want to do a particular research project in history, for instance. You might want to be you might wonder how ideas of how maybe pictures in science, let's say scientific atlases, have changed over the years, and you might want to take one manuscript from, I don't know, the 1600s and another from the 1900s, let's say, and compare the pictures and what the sort of pictures seem to be saying and telling us about how people visualize stuff in science over the years. And you can use this site to you can use this idea, sorry, to extract just all of the pages that have images and then compare them, rather than having to spend absolutely hours sorting through 1,000, 2,000 page manuscripts. So that would be one use of this sort of more difficult material. Another, which is perhaps more directly supercurricular, is an example taken from an ecology journal. So if you've got an interest in ecology, you might want to look at a particular article in an academic journal like this. And in this example, this is there's some fairly technical things going on in this in this article, and and there's sort of just some ideas here for how you might break up this piece of text into a way that's sort of manageable, and even if you don't understand it at the end completely, will end up helping you look for resources that you do understand and sort of engaging in a research project. So you might divide this, as one suggestion, for instance, into two sections. So, well, two types of section. The more, the less technical stuff. So typically in science papers, that's abstract introduction discussion, for some things anyway. Some things, even those, are quite complicated. And you might also divide, and another type of section would be the more technical stuff, and that's typically method and results. And you might try and gauge what you can from the abstract introduction and discussion, follow up on references, look at things at a slightly lower level if things aren't quite clear to you, and then actually gain a pretty good appreciation of the subject. And then if you want to look at the method and results and understand a bit more of the technical stuff, you might try and pinpoint a particular idea or piece of mathematical machinery that's leading to, that's giving rise to these technicalities, that's making these sections more complicated. So in this article, most of the formalism just comes from this particular model that they're using in their study. And you can literally just Google the model, and you can find that, you can even download the code to run the model yourself. You can find lots of interesting, very transparent videos about the model. And the aim of showing you this is that even difficult material like this, you can sort of modulate and break down into pieces, and then you can use that as a basis for further supercurricular engagement. So, don't look at very difficult articles as things that you have to read and be able to understand completely, but rather look at them as essentially as tools. You can use this article, you can break it down into different pieces and pinpoint certain ideas that are of use, and then use that as a basis for supercurricular exploration. You can sort of work up to understanding it, and that contrasts, right, with A levels. So you can you can build on A levels and sort of work up to something that's slightly more challenging. And with these kinds of things, you can almost work down to understanding something that that's more complicated than A levels, but is slightly less complicated than this. And then so hopefully that makes sense. And then there's just another example quickly of arts and humanities difficult journal article article. I think this would be fairly complicated. This article from Philosopher's Imprint is called An Essentialist Theory of the Meaning of Slurs, and I think this is a really interesting topic, but without some of the requisite ideas in philosophy of language and also feminist philosophy, this might be difficult to approach. But again, even if it is, you can use this really interesting piece of work that perhaps merges ideas that aren't merged anywhere else, especially not in introductory articles or A-level syllabuses. You can use this as a platform for further exploration. You can say, oh, well, I think that you know, these ideas in philosophy of language and their application to something like you know, feminist theory, that's really interesting, and I want to learn more about that. And then you can start using some of the things like, you know, course reading lists, open library, even stuff like HE+, maybe to start trying to find out a bit more about it, maybe even online courses or just Googling stuff. Yeah, so hopefully that then gives you a sense of how you might use various difficult journal articles to enhance your supercurricular engagement. And just note that hopefully throughout this talk, what hopefully has been clear is that I haven't at any stage told you to sort of go off and read lots of very, very complicated books that you don't understand. I've suggested sort of, you know, really trying to break up what you're doing into small, manageable chunks that you actually do understand. And then the real benefit, the thing that looks really impressive is critical engagement with those particular things. So we, you know, I mean, I guess the summary is that we would rather you think intelligently and in a very modular way about the stuff that you're looking at, try and break it up, rather than reading whole books, powering through entire things that you sort of only half understand, only to put it on your personal statement. It's that kind of, yeah, it's the smaller, more manageable, more modular stuff that's actually more useful from our perspective. So hopefully in terms of this idea of sort of making the most of your summer, there, in many respects, it's good news, because you don't have to power through loads and loads of books and spend your entire summer reading, but rather, you know, you set time aside to do this more modular work. So I hope that, I'm sorry for overrunning a bit, but yeah, I hope that's given you a sort of a flavor of the of how we want you to approach supercurricular engagement. And then I'm happy to take some questions now.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Will, for all that information that you've given us there. What we're going to do now is we're just going to spend about sort of 5 minutes or so answering some of the questions that have come in. There are a lot of questions that have come in, so I will just remind you again, in case you weren't here at the start when I ran through the programme. We're going to, so all of us in the admissions team will be back at 3:30, from 3:30 till 4:30, till 4 o'clock this afternoon to answer any remaining questions that you have. So don't worry if we don't get to your question now. I'm going to start with a question that quite a few people have been asking, actually. Does work experience count as a form of supercurricular? And if we should do work experience, sort of what's the view on that this year in light of the pandemic, where it might be a bit harder to get work experience?
Yeah. I mean, typically, work experience for some subjects can be useful. I mean, in particular, you know, for things like medicine, it can be a good way of understanding whether or not you want to be a doctor, for instance. In terms of making an academic application to us, though, it's not something that we look that heavily at, even, you know, pre-pandemic. The main thing that we are interested in is the stuff that I've been going through. So these more, let's call them theoretical activities that you can sort of do online in your own home. And obviously with the pandemic, we are far more lenient in terms of people who have, you know, haven't been able to get work experience anyway. So yeah, I think just on both counts, yes, it could be useful for you personally, but we don't lend particular weight to it in the application process. The main stuff to do is this kind of more theoretical supercurricular engagement, and every university will be more lenient in terms of COVID. So it's not something to really, if you haven't managed to get any work experience, there's no need to worry about it at all, is what I would say.
Thanks, Will. Another question is, would an EPQ be a good demonstration of sort of supercurricular outside the curriculum learning?
Yeah, absolutely. I think with the EPQ, it's I mean, it's a great thing to do if you can. Obviously, we don't put any weight on the EPQ in terms of an offer, and we don't, and no one's disadvantaged who hasn't done one, because obviously not everyone can. But yeah, it ticks a lot of the boxes. It ticks a lot of the things that I've been talking about. one thing to say there is obviously that if you've done an EPQ, that probably isn't sufficient. You want to do more stuff. You want to do often what you want to do is a smaller scale research project. So whereas the EPQ is fairly long, and you do it over a decent amount of time, you might want to give yourself a couple of weeks to look at a particular problem or a particular idea, engage with that, and then move on perhaps to the next thing. That can sometimes be quite a useful way of practicing some of these skills. I mean, in particular, because in the EPQ, you write the essay once, right? I mean, obviously you rewrite it, but you write the essay based on your research one time, and the process of rewriting and stuff is part of that. But if you're doing a few smaller projects where you might write less, you might write 500 or 1,000 words or something, and you might do that more regularly, that's giving you a good amount of practice, and honing some of those skills that perhaps you only get to practice once on the EPQ, locating resources, for instance.
Thank you. Somebody's asked, is it encouraged if you're applying for a modern language to read or listen to material in that language? So should you be engaging in the language that you're applying for, do you think?
I'm probably not the best person to answer that, but I mean, my gut reaction would be yes. I mean, obviously, you can, when you're applying for things like modern languages, you don't always need to have studied the language at A level. You can sort of go into a subject with less knowledge. But it is a good idea. It shows interest. It helps. It ticks some of the boxes that I was mentioning earlier, right? It will help you in something like interview. It will help you with your A levels. It will probably help with just finding the undergraduate course a lot easier, because obviously undergraduate courses for languages are demanding. So you've got a head start on that kind of stuff now. So yes, definitely.
Thank you. Quite a few people have been asking sort of very subject-specific questions, so like where can I find resources for psychology? Where can I find resources for modern languages? That sort of thing. Are you able to sort of just give some advice on how to go about finding those resources rather than going through each subject by subject, just for time?
Yeah, so I mean, one thing that it is very useful to use, I mean, some of the resources that I've mentioned already, so HE Plus, for instance, course reading lists, online course websites, those kinds of things. Those are a really good place to start. Even just Googling particular terms, like I sort of mentioned earlier. But those broader, more holistic sites are very good, and you can use those as a starting point. So there's no particular way in which you're going to, or specifically approved way in which you're going to arrive at a research project or particular materials. You sort of find some of this out for yourself by the direction you want your work to take. But say you go onto an online course website, you go on psychology, and you find a suitably difficult psychology course that is challenging, but you actually understand. Then once you've done that course, you might want to follow up on particular topics of interest within that. So you might find you might spend a bit of time Googling, finding podcasts, archives, things like that that relate to those topics, and then you might, and to be honest, then you've actually done an online course, found papers, listened to podcasts and stuff, and that's that could be you done for that particular research project. But yeah, there's no there is no particular site for finding some of this stuff in many respects. If there is, it's probably HE Plus, to be honest, and using some of the further resources on that.
Thank you. We can take, I think, just probably 2 more questions now. So would you consider sort of educational YouTube videos or channels such as TED Talks or The Economist a form of supercurricular engagement? So kind of maybe along the lines, a few people have been asking, like some of these like academic journals that you mentioned are quite challenging. Do you have to engage with this very, very high level academic journals, or can people be looking at TED Talks and that sort of thing?
Yeah, you definitely don't have to. But I think it's a sort of thing where you sort of have to gauge it for yourself. So you have to look at an article and think, is this going to prove too complicated? And if it does, please don't feel disheartened by that, because this is complicated stuff that we don't expect you to have mastered. But what you might do in that situation is you might find an article after a bit of searching that perhaps you understand half of, and you have loads and loads of questions about it, but you've actually gained you've got something positive from the experience of trying to read it, and that is in itself a very useful thing to do. But by all means, listen to things like TED Talks. I suppose the thing that I should have emphasized actually in the talk is that there's this distinction between sort of passive learning and active learning, where it's the kind of active engagement in the subject, like what I was saying with looking at the history of virtual classrooms, writing writing notes about a particular paragraph, writing a response to questions about them. So that kind of engagement helps you choose a topic, it helps you a subject, or it helps you sort of develop academically, whereas just reading something, just listening to something often isn't nearly as instructive. So it's less about whether you should be listening to TED Talks and more about how you should be engaging with that stuff. If you are listening to a TED Talk, you're writing notes, you're thinking you're going to follow up on these references, you're making sure that the stuff is actually challenging and it's not just stuff that you sort of already know from A level or isn't surprising to you, for instance. If you're doing that kind of stuff, that's what's going to sort of make your application competitive. So in many respects, it is less about what you look at in particular, and it's less about whether particular resources are good or not, and it's more about how you approach your subject, either actively or passively. I hope that makes sense.
Thank you. And then last question, just a note of advice maybe. How do you balance supercurricular with your academic studies?
So one thing that I hope has come across to an extent is that the supercurricular stuff really should complement what you're doing in A levels. That's the first thing. It shouldn't be the case that you're just reading this, I don't know, let's say, all of Marx's Capital or something like that, just, completely in isolation to your A levels, and you're sort of just trying to power through it, and it's not making you particularly happy, and you're not really retaining anything from it. Obviously, that would be quite difficult to balance with A levels in many respects. But if you are engaging in a more modular way, in a way that maybe will complement A levels, you're researching topics that are covered in A level in more depth, for instance, that already goes some way towards helping you balance. But I mean, the other thing I would say is that it's really important just to take breaks from this kind of stuff, not to be doing it all the time. Because in a way, this talk is kind of misleading. It says making the most of your summer, but hopefully the idea that I have emphasized it is not about doing loads and loads of work. It's about doing smaller pieces of work in a sort of more, in an intelligent way. It's approaching, it's working smart, not hard, essentially. And I think that is really important. So, make sure that you do other stuff over summer and over year 13 as well. Take appropriate breaks, and just note that we're not expecting you to do this stuff all the time. Like, your subject should interest you and you should be passionate about it, but it's, you're still probably a very competitive Cambridge applicant if it's not what you want to be doing all the time. You don't have to, you can be reading a history primary text and think, actually, I'd much rather be outside not reading this and still be really enthusiastic about your subject. It's not a requirement at all. So I hope that helps to some extent.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Will, for all the advice you've given, all the resources that you've shared there as well.